G'day you mob, Pete here, and this is another episode of Aussie English, the number one place for anyone and everyone wanting to learn Australian English. So today I have a Goss episode for you where I sit down with my old man, my father, Ian Smissen, and we talk about the week's news, whether locally down under here in Australia or non-locally overseas in other parts of the world. Okay, and we sometimes also talk about whatever comes to mind, right? If we can think of something interesting to share with you guys related to us or Australia, we also talk about that in the Goss. So these episodes are specifically designed to try and give you content about many different topics where we're obviously speaking in English and there are multiple people having a natural and spontaneous conversation in English. So it is particularly good to improve your listening skills. In order to complement that though, I really recommend that you join the podcast membership or the academy membership at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get access to the full transcripts of these episodes, the PDFs, the downloads, and you can also use the online PDF reader to read and listen at the same time. Okay, so if you really, really want to improve your listening skills fast, get the transcript, listen and read at the same time, keep practicing, and that is the quickest way to level up your English. Anyway, I've been rabbiting on a bit, I've been talking a bit. Let's just get into this episode, guys. Smack the bird, and let's get into it. All right, Dad, welcome to this episode of the Goss, number 2.
Hey, Pete. Hey, everyone.
For the take here.
Yes, take 2. The take 2 was a little technical error, so we've been dicking around here trying to get it fixed up.
I'm just going to quickly
just spin that around so that, and
that I can
now you've
see
buggered up
myself.
the audio. No, there we go. We're right
That's
now.
it, exactly. Keep playing around or we'll keep going.
Keep talking.
That's
Keep
it.
talking. Yeah, I'll sort of get up and dance so you're not noticing what Pete's doing. No, trust me, you'd turn off.
And I need to hire someone to do this. Just take care of the recording of everything so that I don't have to think about the cameras and the microphones and everything, the audio at the same time as trying to ask intelligent questions.
The trouble with that is
that
you need a sort of, I hesitate to say proper setup, but you need a standardised setup that you're not moving things around. And that way you can shift all the audio controls and video controls and switches and things off to a second desk and have another person sitting there. But
playing with it all.
One day when we're rich and famous.
So how's your week been?
Yeah, yours has been
sports.
busy. You've been all over the place. And we've had, since we last talked, we've had the AFL and NRL grand finals, the Australian Football League and the National Rugby League. So the two biggest sporting competitions in Australia. Both had their final matches.
Were you happy with the outcomes?
Well, Melbourne teams won both, despite the fact that nobody has been able to play any competitive sport in Victoria for 6 months because of COVID isolation. The team that I hate, and I think I was talking about it last time, where you asked who do you think will win, and I said, well, my heart says Geelong, my head says Richmond. Well, Richmond won the AFL, and as I think I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of Richmond because of and I think I'm still wearing the scars of the umbrella beating I took from an old lady supporter when I was a kid. But it was a good game. So it was sort of inevitable, by the time, the last quarter, it was sort of all over, but it was a good game to watch. And I only watched half of the NRL grand final. I watched the entertaining bit from the score point of view, but the less entertaining bit if you're a Melbourne supporter, because Melbourne got out to a big early lead, and then the opposition sort of cut them back and didn't quite make it. So it was entertaining to watch in terms of, can they hang on? But all the really cool stuff happened in the first half, and I had it recorded, but in the end I thought once you know the result, there's not much point watching it. So, so that was pretty cool. And now we're into the draft period for the AFL, which is always a circus.
Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, we have these really complicated sort of rules and processes for trading and drafting players. So immediately after the season has finished, then clubs are able to trade players between clubs, and there are rules for how they can do that, and there's a time period they can do it. It's a 2-week time period that they have to do that. But you'd think that would be quite simple, that, any player that, either wanted to leave a club or a club that, wanted to delist a player or move them on, could trade with other clubs, and they can trade for other players, or they can trade for draft picks, and we'll talk about the draft in a minute. But it's more complicated than that, because we have this sort of free agency thing that we've sort of copied from American sports, which isn't a bad idea. But the concept behind that is, if a player has played with the same club for a long time and they come out of contract, then they should automatically be able to leave if they choose to, rather than the club holding them and not allowing them to go. So we have this free agency period that sort of overlaps with the standard trade period, where players who are in that sort of are eligible for free agency can go. But then we have we complicate it even further by the free agency being split into restricted free agency and unrestricted. So unrestricted is basically, if you played with the same club for 10 years and you are out of contract, then you are eligible just to move on to any club of your choice. And the AFL will, rather than having to worry about a trade, the AFL will actually give a benefit back to the club that loses the free agent in the form of a draft pick, high draft pick, so that you don't have these problems of clubs arguing the point about what they get in return. The AFL have a formula for that. But that's an unrestricted free agent. But then we have a restricted free agent, and that is, if you've been with the club for 8 years and you are now out of contract, then you can do the same thing. But instead of it just being open slather and a player being able to leave, the club that they are already at can have the option of matching the offer that the player gets from another club, and the player can't choose not to go. Or they can't sort of just deny it. So if I was playing for Melbourne Football Club and I'm going to a restricted free agency, Richmond Football Club could come and say, we're going to pay you $500,000 a year for the next 5 years. Do you want to come play for us? And I'll say yes. And then Melbourne Football Club would have the option to say, we'll match that deal, give you $500,000. I then have the option of taking it from Melbourne or going into the draft.
Yeah, and seeing if
Richmond will still do the same thing, or someone will offer me more, or whatever. Whereas if you're an unrestricted free agent, Richmond says, we'll go offer you $500,000 a year for 5 years. I can just say yes, and I'm gone.
Yeah.
And then the AFL gives some compensation back for that. So all of that happens before the trade period, or before the draft period, and then we have 2 rounds of drafting. So we have the draft. The standard draft is mostly players who come up through underage football, under 18s football, are going to be drafted. So it's the kids getting their first opportunity to play in the big league. And then there are other times where other players who've never played in the AFL can also go in. They might not be 18. They could be 20, 25 and playing in this next tier down. They can go into that draft. But then other players from each club that don't get traded, they get dropped from a list or whatever, they can go into a second draft called the pre-season draft. So you have all of these sort of weird things going on right at the period at the end of the season when you think, football's finished, and then you have 3 or 4 weeks of just this circus.
It's interesting that you spectate on that as well. Like you're interested in following it and watching it. Is it televised much, or it's?
Well, there's. We have a one of our paid TV services, Fox,
like Foxtel,
has a channel dedicated to AFL and a channel dedicated to the NRL. So during this period, they'll have 2 or 3 shows on a day. Most of the rest of the post-season, they'll be playing replays of old games, but they'll have 2 or 3 shows a day related to what's going on in the trade every day. And then right at the last minute, they'll be just going all day. They'll just be on live on TV talking about, this trade has now gone through and whatever. And of course, there's a lot of the player managers are holding their cards close to their chest right until the last minute. There's usually 2 or 3 trades that get done in the last few minutes of the trade period, because the longer you hold out, the more chance you've got of getting a better offer. But then there's also a chance that the clubs are just going to drop you and go, well, bad luck, we're going to go for them.
So that you don't end up
you end up nowhere, and then you've got to go into a draft period. So
who does this work in favour of? Is it both at times favourable for the players who are obviously well sought after, like, say, Gary Ablett, leaving Geelong, where his father had played? His father is probably one of the best footballers of all time, right? And then Gary Ablett Jr., his son, played for Geelong, and I think there's a rule, isn't there? Or I don't know. There's something that ends up being where they play for the team that their father was in, right?
Yeah, we have a father-son thing, and that, again, complicates the whole drafting thing. So I think we're the only sport in the world that has a father-son, and now it could potentially be parent-child. Because we have a women's competition.
Yes.
Now, it's going to be a long time before we have women who have played who have children.
Long enough to have children.
It'll be 20 years before that is likely to happen.
Yeah. The women's league started only a few years ago, guys.
Yeah, so it's only 3 or 4 years old. But it is quite likely now that we could have, because the women's teams are associated with the men's teams. It's not a one-for-one. There aren't 18 women's teams, but each of the women's teams is associated with the men's team. So it could be possible that we would have a young girl who gets drafted into a women's league team on the basis that her father played for that club. It's never happened yet, and I don't know whether the rules are there, but I think if it would be very hard for them not to do it if somebody claimed. So the way the
potential to be taken to court.
Exactly. So the way the current system with the father-son, which has been father-son for over 100 years, so I'll call it that, the way that father-son rule operates is that if a junior player who is eligible for the draft has a father who played 100 games for a club, then that club is eligible to make an offer for that player during the draft at any time during the draft when they're if that player gets, so they can, if this year whoever's got the first pick could choose a father-son in the first pick and they're done. But typically they don't do that. What they'll do is, again, let's say, I want to play for Melbourne. My father played 100 games for Melbourne. And when Richmond select me in the draft, then Melbourne can say, no, we'll want to take them on father-son and we have to swap our next draft pick for that. So
Richmond then get
that next draft pick. It's a little more complicated than that because it's related to if my draft pick was 20 picks lower, then I'd have to give up 2 picks and so on. So there's a little formula for that as well. But so it allows clubs to choose players, which is a really interesting idea because originally the Victorian Football League came out of suburban football clubs. So it was a big family thing. So.
Is this all kind of done this way to avoid just the teams with a lot of money ending up with the best players so that you don't end up with pooling of all the talent and one team just always cleaning up?
The draft is done for that, and we have a salary cap as well.
Yeah, so that again, the rich teams can't just be like, we'll give you $10 million and the other teams that are poor can't be like...
And so there are actually 2 salary caps. There's the player salary cap and then there's the total football management, so which is separate from the player payments. So a club can't go out and hire 20 high-class coaches at $1 million a year each.
I think it's good, though, because it's kind of like Formula One racing, right, where they limit all the... Although...
Theoretically, but Mercedes is unbeatable at the moment. So,
well, it used to be Ferrari.
It used to be, so...
Yeah, it is. I don't know. It's good, but I had 2 sort of questions here. Who do the drafts sort of work in favour of? Like, I imagine that it's the team first and foremost, but do players get much power in where they end up going?
Not in the draft.
Only if they're really sought after.
Not in the draft.
Still not in the draft.
No, because the draft, the order that clubs can choose players in the draft is in reverse order from where they finished in the competition the year before. So if you finish on top, you get the 18th pick. If you finish on bottom, you get the first pick.
It's later on. It's other stuff
then
with contracts.
Cycles around. And then you can swapping draft picks and doing all sorts of things. Like my football team, Essendon, at the moment has the 7th draft pick because of where they finished.
Yeah.
But it looks like because during the trade, they are likely to pick up the 6th and the 8th. So they'll have 3 picks in a row because they've traded players and got compensations and so on. So it's not quite that, but that's the way. Again, that's an equalisation thing.
Yeah.
But then you throw that salary cap idea on the top of it, which means that I can't just offer everybody a lot of money.
Well, you have a limit.
There's a total limit for your 40-something players on the list.
I think that was a bit of the drama to finish the Gary Ablett Jr. story, was that he ended up playing for the new team at the time called the Suns.
Gold Coast Suns.
The Gold Coast Suns, which was just a new team. So I think in order for them to sort of get a leg up, to have an advantage. When they first came in, they hired Gary Ablett to play for their move from
Geelong. And he was a free agent, so he could just choose to go.
But they blew like the majority of their funds on him, right?
He was getting
paid millions of dollars over a period.
He was getting paid more than $1 million a year. I think he was the highest paid per year. He was the highest paid player in the league when he took that contract. But they could afford to do that because they were drafting a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And when the new team came into the competition, there was the draft was highly compromised because, in fact, there was 2 years in a row we had 2 new teams come in.
Yeah,
so
the other one was the
Greater Western Sydney Giants. They came in the year after the Suns. So in both cases, the first year or 2 years that they were there, they got the majority of the first round draft picks.
Yeah.
But what that meant was that they ended up with a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
And those kids were clearly not going to be paid as much as an established high-quality player.
Well, they had
so their salary cap of the Suns, they could afford to pay players. Now, it even gets even more complicated than that, because if you offer somebody a 5-year contract, you could say, well, we'll give you $500,000 for 5 years, but we're going to pay you $250,000 in the first year, but we'll pay you $750,000 in the 5th year, so they can reduce their salary cap this year while they've still got ongoing contracts with existing players, and they back end the higher payments, because by their 3rd or 4th or 5th year of the contract, the clubs will be able to manage their players will leave, players will come out of contract, retire, and so on. So they'll be able to manage their salary cap that way. So it's a really complicated process.
The second question I had before we finish this up about AFL is, what is the sort of what are the ethics around hiring children effectively fresh out of high school to play these sorts of sports and suddenly get massive wages, at least comparatively? Like they would probably, these kids, I would imagine, at least when I was doing jiu-jitsu, one of my friends played in the VFL, and he was on $75,000 a year.
And that's in the second tier competition.
So the VFL is the second. It's like the seconds versus the first. AFL is above that. VFL is below that.
I think a first-year player, whether they play or not, so an 18-year-old walking into an AFL club first year will be on roughly $100,000 a year.
Which is, probably more than I'm making.
For average school leaver, that's a lot of money.
That's more than the average Australian is
almost no other job that an 18-year-old is going to walk into and earn that sort of... And that's without even playing.
Yeah. That's their
base. Yeah. And then it might be slightly less than that, but there'll be a game payment thing. So if they actually start playing, they'll get more per game and so on.
Yeah.
And getting back to your question about the ethics of certainly the ethics of drafting kids into a profession that has a limited time frame is, I think, a bigger thing than the money. But we'll deal with the money first.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of drug problems with kids, not performance-enhancing drugs, but illicit drugs.
Yeah, they get quite often up in the news for doing cocaine alcohol.
I say a lot. There might be a handful a year, and we're talking about hundreds of players, and so. But these are your average. They're teenage, early 20s, young men, highly driven, highly competitive. A lot of money comparatively, and nothing to do.
And they burn it all.
Yeah. So most clubs, and that was a problem when the draft first came in and clubs were starting to become professional, but clubs very quickly learned, and most clubs are very good at maintaining a quality of life with players. And trying to make sure that those players have got something else to do.
Yeah.
Because that second thing that I was talking about is there's a very limited time frame. The average length of contract that is fulfilled in a drafted AFL player is less than 2 years. Now that's high. There's a long tail on that because there'll be 50% of players who get drafted will never play a game.
Yeah.
The other 50%.
So they're just on the bench, are they? They're just waiting.
They're just they're training. They might be playing in a VFL or a South Australian Football League or Western Australia or so on. They'll be playing football, but they won't be playing at that highest level in the AFL team. Then there are the players who make it, And then there's the risk of injury. You know, you can have a career-threatening injury. And what do you do after that?
Well, I think you told me back in the day that Australian rules football is one of the most dangerous sports in the world in terms of the rate of injury.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that you're going to die.
No,
but
not deaths, but
just how frequently you get put out.
Career-threatening injuries, mostly leg injuries.
Yeah.
Knee and ankle
and
injuries. And so you've got this situation where you've got young men earning a lot of money, not necessarily saving it, not necessarily doing much else, but and clubs are much better at handling that now. I certainly know the club that I'm a member of has for a long time had a process of encouraging their players to go to university and study
at the same time,
or to have a part-time job. And those that couldn't get a part-time job, the club used to employ them, and often they would employ them as apprentices with groundskeepers, with the builders who are working, carpenters and things who are working in the club, so that players would come out of their football career with a job or something to go on to, because there are very few professional sporting careers that are going to keep them in the game.
As a commentator or something.
You're going to be you go into the media, but there'll be maybe 10 players a year that will go into the media, and that requires a different skill level as well. Yeah. You need to be presentable, not in terms of the way you look, but you need to be able to talk coherently. If you're going into the print media, you need to be able to write. So there's a skill set there. And then others might go into coaching, but there's still a limited number of those jobs. So, and look, that's not AFL specific. That would be true for many other sports.
Yeah, 100%.
I think the NFL, the National Football League in America, is even shorter, the average time that a player will actually play.
But you were telling me too recently there's a guy that's still playing and he's 46 or I can't remember what they...
43, Tom Brady, the greatest player of all time. His nickname is the GOAT.
And he's like getting...
He's a quarterback.
He's 7 years away from 50.
Yeah.
And he's dominating kids that are still coming out and playing fresh at 18.
But it's highly unusual, but if you're going to play the position you're going to play in the NFL to do that, you will be the quarterback.
Because you're what?
Because you're the protected species.
You're
the protected species.
Yeah.
Now, if you get hit big time.
Yeah. So everyone else is 150 kilos.
He got a knee injury and was out for a year. 10 years ago. He's a freak. So there's very few players that are playing in that game beyond their early 30s.
So before we finish, where do you think the next team in the AFL is going to be set up?
Oh, it has to be Tasmania.
You reckon?
Yeah.
Why not WA? Why not another one there?
Well, we've got 2 in WA, 2 in South Australia, 2 in New South Wales, 2 in Queensland.
No Northern Territory team, though. Not enough people
10 in
there,
Victoria. The trouble with the Northern Territory, there's not enough people. There's about the same number of people in the Northern Territory as there is in Tasmania.
I thought you were going to say Ocean Grove.
Ocean Grove.
Our hometown.
But Tasmania has got a long history of being an Australian football state. So lots of players from Tasmania get through to playing, second tier and AFL level football in other states. The challenge is that there's only 500,000 people in Tasmania. So
it's like Greater Geelong.
Yeah, exactly. But Greater Geelong has a football team.
Geelong, the Cats.
The second football team, the second oldest football team in Australia.
Although it'd suck to be in Tasmania because you're going to have to get on a plane or a boat every single time you want to play a game effectively, unless it's at home. So
but most, other than Victorian teams, every other team is effectively flying interstate to play every second week.
Yeah.
Because they'll play their own home games, 22 games in a season. They'll play their 11 home games. They'll play an extra home game or an extra game at home when they play the other team from their state. But for the other 10 games a year, they're flying interstate. So Tasmania wouldn't be significantly different from that point of view. The challenge is going to be finding corporate sponsorship and membership there. At the moment, we have 2 Victorian clubs who have an agreement to play games in Tasmania, so there is certainly interest to have AFL football there.
Which teams are they?
Screaming out Hawthorn and North Melbourne. Hawthorn. Tasmanian government is their major sponsor. And so they play 4 games a year, and I think North Melbourne play 2 games a year in Tasmania. So that's half a season, in terms of home games. In terms of home games,
gotcha.
6 games in Tasmania. They only need to have another 5. So it's not like they can't support football going on there. The challenge is when you put a club there, it costs clubs, I would think, in the order of tens of millions of dollars a year just to operate, not just to pay players and things, because that sort of money. So just to operate, you're going to have that sort of infrastructure to be around you. But we pushed teams into Sydney and to Brisbane and the Gold Coast, where there was no AFL background,
and it worked.
And it's worked mostly. I think the Gold Coast Suns have struggled. For whatever reason. It's ironic, and I understand the push to go to the Gold Coast because the Gold Coast, half the population of the Gold Coast are ex-Melbourne people. So there is a definite interest in football there, but there's almost no major corporations there. They'd all be coming from Brisbane anyway. So there isn't a local financial support for it. But anyway, it's... I hope it's Tasmania. It would make sense to be Tasmanian.
I'm still yet to go there. I've never been to Tassie, so it'll be cool to go there and watch a game with you.
It's an amazing place to go.
Well, now that I'm into whiskey, it definitely seems like it's an amazing place to go. There are a lot of distilleries there. Far out. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode, guys, and we'll see you in the next one. Alrighty, you mob, thank you so much for listening to or watching this episode of The Goss. If you would like to watch the video, if you're currently listening to it and not watching it, you can do so on the Aussie English TV channel on YouTube. This is different from the main channel. You'll be able to subscribe to that. Just search Aussie English TV on YouTube. And if you're watching this and not listening to it, you can check this episode out also on the Aussie English podcast, which you can find via my free Aussie English podcast application on both Android and iPhone. You can download that for free, or you can find it via any other good podcast app that you've got on your phone. Spotify, podcasts from iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is. I'm your host, Pete. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a ripper of a day, and I will see you next time. Peace.